The Christmas night over the water did not look holy at all. The sea was a sheet of black glass chopped by wind. Spray blowing sideways through freezing rain that needled any exposed skin. Low clouds pressed down over the coastal village. A gray lid that swallowed sound and killed any chance of helicopters or close air support finding clean air to work in. The whole shoreline felt like a place the map was still arguing over. Lights scattered in patches and long stretches of darkness in between. In that darkness, a United States Navy SEAL platoon moved through narrow alleys. Shapes in wet gear guiding a hooded figure who shuffled between them. The high-value courier had already been pulled out of his safe house. Wrists bound. Head down. Pushed forward each time he slowed. They were in the middle of exfiltration now. Not running, but close to it. Moving fast enough that their breath showed in hard bursts whenever a sliver of light caught them. Every step took them farther from the pickup point they had planned and closer to the alternate route that the weather had forced on them. Up above them, Megan Doyle lay in a shallow rooftop hide, pressed into the rough concrete as the wind clawed over the edge. She was a United States Marine Corps Scout Sniper Sergeant, an E5 from the Marine Corps, loaned out as an augmentee, sent here to be overwatch while the platoon did the snatch and grab work below. From the first brief on the mission, she had felt the slight edge in their eyes, the unspoken line between the team and the outsider who wore a different uniform. They listened when she talked about fields of fire and likely routes, but the respect always stopped 1 inch short of treating her as one of their own. Her little world on the roof was a tight circle of gear and cold air. A radio sat clipped where her gloved hand could find the push to talk without looking. Cables running under her jacket to keep them from snagging. Her ruck was tucked behind a low parapet. Heavy, with the weight of extra magazines and just enough sustainment for a short stay. Not a long one. The only soft thing in reach was a tiny string of battery-powered lights that she had looped once around a broken pipe, throwing a faint warm glow that barely touched the corners of the hide. From somewhere deeper in the village, a Christmas carol drifted up in broken pieces. Warped by distance and weather, the tune stumbled in and out of key, carried on a cheap radio that faded every time the wind shifted. But the melody was still familiar enough to sting. Megan listened with one part of her mind while the rest stayed on the alleyways, her eyes moving from doorway to intersection, tracing the paths the platoon would use as they headed toward the water. In her ear, the net crackled with short updates. The platoon pushing farther away with each calm, clipped report. Before they peeled off, one of the SEAL leaders had paused just long enough to give her a plan in simple terms. They would move, secure the courier, and swing back through for her in about 20 minutes. Weather and threat picture allowing, their tone had been all business. No doubt. The same way they would talk about recovering a piece of equipment that still had value. Now, as the minutes bled into each other and the rain filled the alley below, she watched the last clear footprints at the base of her building blur and vanish. Water pooled in those prints, turning sharp edges into soft shadows until there was no sign anyone had moved there at all. The village sounds grew thinner as the platoon pulled farther away, leaving only the hiss of rain, the distant carol, and the quiet hum of her tiny light. Megan felt a slow, steady understanding settle in. Not panic. Not surprise. Just a recognition of how nights like this sometimes ended. On this Christmas shoreline, with the sky locked down and the sea waiting, someone was not going to make it out. And from the way the world was already erasing their tracks, she knew it might be the one person they had never fully counted as theirs. Megan Doyle had grown up where the land was flat and the horizon made promises it never kept. Her family farm taught her early what work felt like in the body. Long before the Marine Corps put a uniform on her back, when she showed up at the Scout Sniper workup, she was not the strongest or the loudest, but she was the one who kept showing up, day after day. when other people quietly drifted away. By the time she pinned on her hog's tooth and her sergeant stripes, the instructors already thought of her as the one you could send into bad ground and expect to see again. Over a few deployments, that reputation spread into places her name did not. Joint teams called for a Marine Corps scout sniper, and Megan appeared on manifests as an extra line attached to their task organization. She became an insurance policy for missions that threaded through mountains, cities, and coastlines where visibility was bad and trust in local maps was even worse. People did not always remember the insurance policy when things went well, but they noticed when it was not there. Every Christmas, she went outside the wire. She folded a single page for her younger brother, wrote his name at the top, and sealed it before she could second-guess the words. That letter lived in a slim pocket against her chest rig, tucked where her left hand could find it without looking, under layers of nylon and plate. It was not a dramatic gesture for her. More, a quiet way of acknowledging that nights like this did not always offer a return trip. Knowing the letter was there helped her keep grief in a box while she worked. From the moment she joined the SEAL platoon for this mission, the difference between her and them sat in the air like a faint smell of smoke. At the briefing table, she stood off to one side while the officer in charge, a young lieutenant, and the platoon chief ran through the plan with the team. When they wanted to know fields of fire from the rooftop and likely enemy approaches, they turned to her, listened to her assessment, and nodded in agreement. Once the answers were given, the circle closed again, and she drifted back to the fringe, the augmentee who existed in the margins of their map. On the ground, the pattern stayed the same. The platoon chief took a moment before launch to give her the expectations in clear, short sentences. Maintain overwatch. Keep your communications clean. Cover the exfil corridor. And if comms fail, rally at the alternate. The officer in charge confirmed it with a glance at her radio and her position overlay, treating it as a box checked. There was no insult in their voices, but there was no warmth either. The kind of professional distance reserved for gear that belonged to another unit. Being put on the rooftop hide instead of moving with the main element made tactical sense. And Megan did not argue with that. At the same time, she could feel the quiet line it drew in the dirt. The team going forward together while the outsider stayed alone above them. The glances as they moved out had a pattern she knew well. A quick look to confirm she was in place. Another to make sure her rifle was laid in right. Then eyes shifting back to the people who really counted as us. She had seen that before on other missions and had stopped taking it personally, at least on the surface. When the last boots left the rooftop access and the building trembled with their weight on the stairs, Megan settled into the space they had given her. She checked the radio, listening to the soft hiss and a test call on the net, then adjusted the antenna to keep the signal clean under the low clouds. Her hands ran through a practice sequence on the rifle. Chamber check, optic, sling, and then paused for a heartbeat over the spot where the sealed letter rested against her chest. She traced her route in and out one more time in her mind, accepted that she might never belong to this team in the way they belonged to each other, and chose again to do what she always did: hold her sector and carry the weight no one else wanted to think about. From the rooftop hide, Megan saw the exfil route start to fray long before anyone said it. The alleys that had been mostly empty when the platoon moved in began to fill with civilians. People pushing carts, kids cutting across lanes, doorways spitting out bodies trying to get home or get away. Headlights flashed in the rain, turning the narrow streets into tunnels of glare and shadow that made it hard to see who was who. The black water at the edge of the village felt very far away from where she lay behind her rifle. The weather pressed down harder, turning the low cloud ceiling into a solid weight over the town. Every few minutes, someone on the net tried to get clarity on air and got the same answer in different words. Ceiling is low. Visibility is bad. Air is limited. Solve it on the ground. The wind pushed the freezing rain sideways, soaking antennas and making every movement feel heavier and slower. Megan could hear the frustration under the professional tone. The quiet way people accepted that no helicopter was going to swing in and clean this up. Radio traffic picked up, the calm rhythm from earlier breaking into overlapping calls. Voices cut in with contact reports. Short bursts of information about movement at intersections. Possible armed men shadowing the platoon. Pressure building on their flanks. She heard someone try to push a full update and get chopped by a sharper voice on the net using the word break twice, forcing priority traffic through. Say again, Last and Roger and Wilco stacked over each other. Words clipping as people moved. Turned corners. Adjusted around civilian groups that were suddenly in the wrong place at the wrong time. Down below. The platoon started to bend under that pressure. Not in panic, but in the way a stream bends when something heavy drops into it. Megan watched their markers shift on her mental map, saw how they were being squeezed away from the planned link-up point and toward a narrower corridor closer to the waterline. The officer in charge came up on the net with a voice that sounded older than his face, confirming that the main body was taking contact from multiple angles and could not hold to the original route. The platoon chief backed that assessment with a few blunt words, then called for them to execute the alternate plan. Move now. Keep the package alive. Get the bulk of the team out. From her position, Megan caught only fragments as they hustled away. The sound of boots in water fading between bursts of radio traffic. She understood what the decision meant even before anyone said her name or her call sign. It meant the formation was reorganizing around the courier and the core team, and everything else was sliding down the priority list. She listened for a clear line about her pickup and heard only half sentences. Someone starting to ask about the rooftop and then dropping as another voice cut in with incoming rounds and new contact. In the mix of adrenaline, noise, and cold, the augmentee on Overwatch became less a person and more a point on a map that nobody had time to zoom back in on. Megan stayed on the net, keeping her breathing steady, tracking what she could from the pieces they gave her. The platoon was moving faster now, but the pattern of their turns told her they were no longer choosing the best route. They were being herded by pressure and blocked streets into a channel that could easily become a kill zone. Her own link-up point, the place they had planned to swing past and recover her, was disappearing as an option every time they reported another blocked alley or fresh group of civilians in the way. In the pauses between calls, the village around her went strangely quiet, the kind of silence that makes small sounds, like rain hitting metal and distant music, feel very loud. Below her building, the street emptied out again, leaving only streaks of water where boots had slapped through a few minutes earlier. The freezing rain kept falling, smoothing out scuffed concrete and filling the last shallow prints until they became small, dark pools. Megan understood then, in a slow, solid way, that they were not going to be able to come back for her, not without risking everyone who was still moving toward the sea. She lay there above the empty street, listening to the net crackle and the storm breathe over the village, alone with the knowledge that in this tight, crowded fight, someone had already been left behind. From the rooftop, Megan started to read the village the way other people read a page. The bursts of gunfire were shorter now, but closer together. Not the long, reaching shots of a distant fight, but the tight sound of contact in confined streets. The radio gave her just enough to fill in the gaps. Reports of alleyways blocked. Movement funneled. Pressure pushing the platoon toward the same narrow strip of ground that led to the waterline. It felt less like they were choosing that path, and more like they were being pushed into it. She lay still for a long moment, listening, letting the pattern settle until it stopped feeling like guesswork and started feeling like fact. No one said it on the net. But she could hear the truth in what they were not saying. In the silence where a call to check on her position should have been. Her own corner of the plan had gone quiet. Her link-up point erased by reality. And no one had the bandwidth to redraw it. The augmentee box on the task list was simply empty now. Not maliciously. Just swallowed by the bigger problem. Megan let her cheek rest against the stock of her rifle, eyes tracing the angles that led from her rooftop to the corridor where the platoon was being squeezed. She could see the likely positions a pursuing force would use. The choke points. The windows that looked straight into the backs of men trying to move away from danger. In her head, she flipped the mission card over. Overwatch on one side, rear guard on the other, and let it land with the new label facing up. No report. No request. Just a quiet decision that her job now was to slow whatever was chasing them. She shifted her body a few inches, enough to change her field of view without lifting her silhouette above the line of the parapet. Her left hand broke away from the familiar shape of the radio and went to the magazine, checking it by touch instead of voice, counting rounds with fingers rather than questions. She filled her lungs once, let the air out slow, and repeated the old line in her head. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast. A reminder that speed came from not wasting motion. Her mind ran through 2 or 3 relocation routes, planning where she would move when this rooftop started to draw too much attention. On the net, the chaos kept building. Overlapping calls. Reports of contact tightening behind the platoon as they pushed toward the waterline. Megan waited for a gap. Not long. Just wide enough for one clear sentence that would not get stepped on. And then she pressed the push to talk. Her voice went out level and simple, telling them that they had space and that they should take it. Nothing more. No explanation of what it was costing her to help make that true. Then she went quiet again. Back to scanning, letting their answers fade into background noise while she focused on the shapes moving in the dark. By the time she settled into that new role, something inside her had already crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. She was no longer a point waiting to be recovered on some future timeline that the mission would honor when it could. She had stepped into the empty space between the enemy and the men who had never quite made room for her inside their circle. And she did it without expecting them to notice. Whatever came next would land on her first, because she had chosen to be the last layer of protection for people who saw her as useful, but never as theirs. The first time Megan fired that night, it was almost gentle. Her M110 sat steady under her hands. The semi-automatic rifle, a familiar weight against her shoulder. 7.62 NATO round, already waiting in the chamber. She watched a pair of figures in dark clothing move too quickly along the edge of an alley that paralleled the platoon's route. Rifles held the way people hold tools they know how to use. When one of them started to angle toward a corner that would give him a clean view into the backs of the retreating team, she exhaled and stroked the trigger. The shot cracked through the freezing air and folded the lead man at the knees. Not a dramatic spin. Just sudden collapse into the wet street. His partner jerked back into cover. Momentum broken. Eyes now looking for a threat they could not see instead of looking for the fleeing Americans. The entire exchange bought the platoon only a few seconds. But in Megan's calculation, those seconds were exactly what mattered. In her mind, that round was a comma in a long sentence, pausing the enemy just long enough to let the words ahead move on. She did not wait to admire the effect. Before the echo finished bouncing off the walls, she was already sliding backward from the parapet, keeping her head below the line of the roof. The M110 stayed tight to her body. Sling snug, muzzle under control, as she crawled to a secondary firing position she had picked hours earlier. She moved with the muscle memory of 1,000 rehearsals, always keeping at least one point of cover between her and any place an eye or a rifle barrel might appear. At the second position, She rose just enough to bring the optic back into play. Cheek, settling into the same groove on the stock. From here, she could see another stretch of the route behind the platoon. A different angle on the same dangerous story. Civic lights flickered on wet walls, and clusters of civilians pressed themselves into doorways as 3 more armed men probed forward, testing the space she had just disrupted. They were not charging recklessly, and that made them more dangerous, not less. On the radio, voices came and went in staccato bursts, each one carrying only the bare minimum. 2 movers south side. Pushing. Contact rear. Small arms. A quick acknowledgement from the platoon chief. Then silence as they crossed another intersection. Megan waited until the pursuing trio stepped into a patch of light and then took another shot. This time hitting the ground inches from their feet on purpose. The round sparking against stone and making them flinch backward. That second shot did not drop anyone, but it stopped them from committing fully to the chase. They hit cover faster, scanned harder, lost their rhythm for a precious fragment of time. Megan marked where they hid, then eased herself away from the edge again, never staying in one place long enough to let them fix her. Off the skyline, she reminded herself, as she moved low toward the rooftop access, staying in the shadows where her outline would dissolve into angles of metal and concrete. Inside the stairwell, the air felt warmer but smelled of damp dust and old cooking smoke. She moved down a level, boots placing softly on the steps, one hand on the rail, the other steady on the rifle. At a half landing, she paused to listen, hearing only the muffled hum of the village and the faintest echo of the distant Christmas carol drifting up from somewhere below. Her gloved hand brushed against her chest rig, fingertips pressing once against the shape of the sealed letter before she pushed through the door to a lower balcony. From that new vantage point, she saw a different slice of the pursuit. A small group of fighters moved along the edge of a market square, trying to cut off the path that led to the waterline. They thought they were moving unseen, hugging awnings and stalled vehicles. But their timing made them vulnerable as they crossed open gaps. Megan brought the optic to her eye again, found the one who seemed to be giving hand signals, and put a round into the wall, inches from his head. The man flinched hard into cover, motioning to his team to pull back. Convinced for a moment that the fire was closer than it was, the group hesitated, looked at each other, then lost a few more seconds figuring out how to advance without stepping into the same line of fire. Megan did not correct their mistake. She let them waste time. Let fear and uncertainty do as much work as her rifle. Then slid back from the railing before anyone could lock onto her exact position. She keyed her radio only when she had something that mattered. 2 movers, alley north pushing fast, she reported, voice steady. Once she watched another pair try to sprint down a lane that paralleled the platoon's movement. Contact shifting east behind you, she added later. When she saw the pattern changing, the pursuit trying to wrap around instead of following directly. Each time she spoke, she kept it to a single clear sentence, then lifted her finger off the push to talk so the net could breathe again. Between the bursts of activity, the night kept reminding her how small she was in the middle of all this. The tiny string light in her old rooftop hide still glowed faintly above her, a weak ember against the hard sky, visible only when she glanced up through broken lines of sight. The Christmas carol drifted in and out of hearing, sometimes lost under gunfire, sometimes weirdly loud in the moments between shots. Each time she left a position, footprints formed in the thin skin of slush on the concrete, only to blur and vanish behind her as the freezing rain filled them in. On one of those moves, cutting through a narrow hallway that smelled of detergent and damp plaster, she stopped just long enough to press her back to the wall and close her eyes. Slow is smooth. Smooth is fast, she told herself again. Not as a slogan, but as a way to slow her racing thoughts down to something she could manage. She pictured the platoon as a shape moving toward the sea, pictured the threat closing behind them, and saw herself as the thin strip of space between the two. Then she pushed off the wall and kept going, because standing still too long in a place like this was its own kind of invitation. The pursuit never turned into a single dramatic charge. It came in waves of small teams, testing alleys, trying windows, probing for gaps in the retreating formation. Each time Megan saw one of those probes forming up in the dark, she found a way to nick it. A single dropped man, a warning shot that made them freeze, or the threat of unseen fire that forced them to detour. Seconds turned into meters. Meters turned into blocks. And each block put more distance between the enemy and the men she was trying to keep alive. By the time she climbed back onto another roof closer to the water, the weight of the rifle felt like an extension of her own bones. She rested in a shallow crouch behind a low wall, breath fogging in the cold. Listening as the net buzzed with updated positions and near misses, she could hear the strain in the voices now, the way the officer in charge and the platoon chief kept their words tight to keep the fear from bleeding through. In all that noise, she waited for a single opening. When it came, just a brief space between calls. She pressed the push to talk and let her voice cut clean through the rain and static. "You have space. Take it," she said, sending the words out like one more carefully placed round, designed to push them forward instead of hold anyone back. Then she released the switch, felt the radio go quiet in her hand, and settled back into the dark, knowing that every inch of that space had come from the shots she had taken and the moves she had made as the invisible shield for a platoon that never really claimed her as their own. The village had gone quiet in a way that did not feel peaceful. From her latest rooftop, lower and closer to the water, Megan could hear only the hiss of freezing rain and the distant rumble of the sea. Her hands were numb inside wet gloves, fingertips stiff from cold and repetition, each reload a little clumsier than the last. The gear on her back felt heavier than it should have, soaked through, straps biting into muscles that had been working since before the first shot. The radio at her shoulder crackled in and out now, the audio thin and distorted as moisture worked its way into connectors and seals. She could still make out enough to follow the shape of the platoon, their calls about distance to the waterline, last turns, shifting security toward the shore. The timing told her what the words did not say. They had the gap they needed now, enough space between their backs and the people chasing them. Any move she made toward them would mean breaking cover, crossing open ground, and dragging that danger back onto their position. She ran the math one more time, because that was the job, not because anything was going to change. Her world narrowed to ranges, angles, the few rounds she had left, and the growing number of muzzle flashes starting to search for her from below. Her body was tired, but her breathing stayed steady, in and out, counting the seconds between each new burst of fire like a metronome. Somewhere under the layers of armor and fabric, she felt the outline of the sealed letter against her chest, a small, steady weight she had chosen to carry. The tiny string light from her first hide still glowed faint in the distance, a warm speck on a cold skyline, just visible when the rain shifted. The broken Christmas carol drifted up again in thin pieces, carried on a radio in some unseen room, the melody wobbling through bad reception. Megan listened to those sounds for a heartbeat, then reached up and pressed the push to talk on her own radio, feeling the plastic slick under her glove. In the same calm tone she had used all night, she sent her last transmission out into the dark. A simple Merry Christmas. Get them home. When she let go of the switch, the radio returned to static and then to almost nothing at all, out toward the waterline. The platoon moved on, shapes shrinking against the black edge of the sea as boats and darkness swallowed them up. On the rooftop, Rain drummed a steady rhythm on concrete and metal, washing away footprints and blurring the edges of everything that had happened there. Megan stayed in that quiet, alone with the storm and the faint echo of a carol, her fate left hanging in the space between the last words she had spoken and the silence that followed. By the time the platoon reached the waterline, they were more shapes than men, hunched against the wind with their gear dragging at their shoulders. The high-value package stumbled between them, soaked, shivering, still alive, which meant the mission was technically a success. Inflatable boats bumped against the shore, crews pulling them in while the surf tried to tear everything back out to sea. For a few stretched seconds, it felt like they had made it here on raw skill and a little luck. Nothing more. The officer in charge did a quick head count in the spray, his brain running faster than his eyes as he tried to match faces to roles in the dark. The platoon chief checked bodies and weapons, making sure nothing critical had been dropped along the way. It took a moment for both of them to notice that what was missing was not something they could touch. Only when the net stayed quiet in a way it had not been all night did they realize there was no steady voice in their ear from the overwatch position. The thought of turning back hung over them like another storm cloud. They both knew what it would mean to push a team that was already burned out back into a narrow corridor that had just tried to kill them. Men were already loading the package into a boat, hands shaking more from adrenaline crash than from the cold. The time for choices had passed, and the decision to keep moving forward settled in their chests like a stone they did not have words for. Later, in a dim debrief room, far from the salt and rain, the night replayed on a screen instead of in their pulses. A small group sat around a table. The officer in charge, the platoon chief, and a few others, while an intelligence specialist scrubbed through ISR footage frame by frame. The overhead view showed the alleys and rooftops in stark contrast, white and black. The platoon, a moving cluster of heat against a web of narrow streets. Only when the playback slowed and zoomed did one small figure on a rooftop begin to stand out. They watched Megan Doyle work the way she always had, without announcement or drama. From above, her M110 was just a flash, a brief streak where a round left the barrel and crossed into the dark, followed by a stumble or a sudden pause in the pursuing element. They saw how she never tried to hold back the entire tide, only clipped the edges, dropped one man here, forced a short halt there, nudged a small team into a slower, safer route. Each tiny disruption added up, the gap between the enemy and the platoon stretching a little more every time she took a measured shot or shifted to a new angle. No one in the room spoke for a long time. Bodies leaned forward in their chairs without anyone seeming to choose it, shoulders tightening when the footage showed enemy teams probing closer to her last rooftop. A hand that had been tapping a pen went still, knuckles whitening around the plastic before letting go. When the audio from the net played her final words, simple and steady, more than one person dropped their gaze to the table. The debrief officer asked the expected questions, clarified distances and timing, marked down how long the pursuit had been delayed by fire from the overwatch positions. The answers came out in short, flat sentences, but the eyes behind them were not flat at all. No one called her the augmentee or the attachment now, and the casual labels from earlier briefs did not show up in any of the talking points. When the session closed, the platoon chief said her name out loud, Megan Doyle, and the way it settled in the room carried equal parts respect and guilt that did not fade when the screen finally went dark. When you step back from that night, the things that stay with you are small and quiet. There is that distant Christmas carol, broken and thin over a bad radio, still trying to sound like home in a place that had none. There is the tiny battery-powered string light in a rooftop hide, a fragile circle of warmth holding out against wind and concrete and rain. And there are those footprints that kept filling with freezing water, sharp edges fading until it looked like no one had ever stood there at all. Together. Those pieces say something about how people can exist in a team. Someone can be absolutely vital in the moment, completely woven into whether everyone else lives or dies, and then slip out of the story as if they were never really in it. In units that pride themselves on performance, especially in elite military circles, the heaviest weight often sits on the shoulders of the quiet ones in the background. They are the ones who get tagged as attachments or enablers. Useful but not really us. Even while everybody steps onto the rope they are holding, Megan Doyle lived in that space, and the way she carried herself offers a hard but human lesson. Real professionalism does not wait for applause before doing the right thing. And real courage does not always come with a promotion ceremony or a welcome into the inner circle. Sometimes, survival rides on a person the group never fully accepted. A person who still chooses to act like they belong to the mission, even if they do not belong to the room. Her last words, "Merry Christmas, get them home," are not just radio traffic. They are a kind of signature on the story of who she chose to be. It is worth looking around your own life and asking who fills that role for you. Maybe it is the teammate who stays late, the friend who always shows up, the family member who handles the hard parts so everyone else can breathe. They may not be on the poster or in the photo, but they are the reason other people make it through their own narrow corridors. Remembering Megan Doyle is one way of remembering them too, and of deciding, in your own quiet way, that you will not let the people who pay the price be erased when the rain comes.